Hello everybody, it's 12 noon, so time to kick off with our webinar on what to do if your participant has no high scores on the HDS. Very warm welcome to you all you people who I can't actually see. And for those of you who don't know me, my name is Gillian Hyde. I'm Director and Chief Psychologist here at PCL. And I've been working with the Hogans and with Hogan Assessments since 1996. So I've got a fair bit of experience of interpreting HDS profiles. And of course, sometimes that means I've had some profiles with no high scores on the HDS, which can of course be a bit of a conundrum. So why are we doing this webinar? Well, I've just said, obviously, having no high scores can be a bit of a conundrum. Also, we do get questions from clients about this kind of scenario. And to be honest, when you get a profile like this, actually, your first thought might be, gosh, what am I going to do with this? I haven't really got anything to say. The HDS isn't really adding anything here. So we thought it would be useful to firstly investigate the prevalence of this phenomenon. How often does it happen? So you know how unusual it is to get a profile with no high scores. And secondly, to outline some strategies for interpreting these kinds of profiles and making the most of them. And then finally, also to see how these kinds of no derailers profile actually might link to bright side personality. What are the strongest and most significant correlates with bright side personality of people who have no high scores on the HDS? And certainly in terms of sign-ups to this webinar, it's been a very popular topic. So I'm assuming that it is a topic that concerns a fair few of you, our clients and users of the Hogan assessments. I thought I should point out actually at the beginning that when I go through the various scenarios, various strategies for looking at these kinds of profiles with no high scores, I will be referring to other Hogan assessments, so the HPI and the MVPI, in my interpretation, because I do tend to use all three together. I'm very aware that not all of you do. Some of you will use the HDS alongside NEO, for instance, or WAVE or OPQ. But hopefully any linkages that I make to the HPI, you can translate to whichever bright side instrument you use. I will also be making some linkages just occasionally to the values profile, so that won't necessarily be quite so easy to translate, but maybe some of you use a different values profile as well. The other thing to point out is that as we go through, if you have any questions, could I please ask you to put those in the chat? And then at the end of the presentation, we'll be reviewing some of those questions and see which ones of them I can answer. Okay. So the first thing I wanted to do is to have a look at the prevalence rates of no high score profiles. Some of you tuning in actually may even have attended our Hogan 25 years event that we did towards the end of last year. And during that conference, we presented some descriptive statistics from data from our archives, and this formed a part of that presentation. So we were able to access our data. So the UK data reported here is from our clients, and it goes back to 2011. And the total sample for our UK data then for the HDS was in excess of 55,000 people. So we asked the data analytics team at Hogan to have a look at the prevalence rate of no high score HDS profiles in our data and to compare that to the global norm sample. So the first cutoff we looked at then was to look at the percentage of the sample with no very high scores, so no scores at the 90th percentile or above, because this is what the reports use, as you will know, as the cutoff for a high risk score. And to be honest, I was quite surprised at the high incidence rate here. You see quite a large proportion of people actually don't get any very high scores across both groups. So for the global sample, it's approximately 28%, and the UK about 39%. So it is quite, it does happen quite often that you'll get a profile with no scores at the 90th percentile above, so no very high scores. So then I asked the team at Hogan to cut the data a different way and to have a look at profiles with no scores at the 85th percentile or above on the HDS, because this, I know percentiles aren't normally distributed, but it's kind of roughly translates to 1 standard deviation above the mean. And when we do this, the percentages come down here, but just a bit. So the global sample, there's about 23% of them getting what I would call no high scores, and the UK sample, about 34% getting no high scores. So again, that's going to be something that happens quite often in terms of profiles that you see. But then we took it one step further even to match the second cutoff on the HDS reports of elevated or moderate scores at the 70th percentile or above. So here we start to see that the incidence level drops dramatically. So for both groups, UK and global, less than 10% of those samples get no scores at the 70th percentile or above. So this is clearly an area that's much more unusual. And in fact, it's probably the one where this webinar is going to be of the most use, because if you've got no very high or high scores, you can at least, but you have got some moderate scores, you can at least discuss the moderate to some extent. But if you haven't got even any moderate scores, it's like, you know, what have you got then? What can you do? Okay, so how might we interpret some of these profiles of either no very high scores or even no moderate scores either? What I want to do is to run through 4 possible scenarios here. And in fact, you guys may have other approaches to this as well. So there might be things you want to put in the chat about ways in which you approach this particular scenario. Okay, so starting with scenario 1, this would be around, has your profile, okay, there aren't any very high scores, but are there some moderate scores here on the profile? How, and to ask around how might they be effective or if ever counterproductive. So when you're talking to an individual, you'd be looking at those moderate scores and saying, look, although these aren't extreme, let's have a look at your HDS profile to see if any of your more elevated HDS scores are actually meaningful for you. And if they are elevated or moderate, then to what extent, explore to what extent can the individual capitalize on the more positive aspects of the potential derailer characteristic, but also to question and discuss, do they ever tip over into a more counterproductive style as well? And before I go through this sample profile that's up here, I've got one general example from a long, long time ago, actually, when we worked with a particular very, very successful syndicate of underwriters, and the chief underwriter there got no high scores on the HDS, but he did get a 74th percentile on mischievous. And when I discussed this with him, it was very clear that he felt he was able to use the charm side of being mischievous and the persuasive and influential kind of side of it to secure resources for his team, basically. He felt if he was ever in competition with other departments in the organization for resources, he always won. And so that could, you know, so that was one way of being very successful in terms of using the positive aspects of getting an elevated score on mischievous. And it wasn't just that, you know, he was also rated very highly through a 360 by his peers, his colleagues, and his line managers in terms of being a very, very effective manager. So that's just one anecdotal example. Here we've got, these are any profiles that I'm going to talk through now are real people. So this profile, you can see, hasn't got any very high scores, but it has got a few elevations. It's got elevations on skeptical, cautious, and imaginative. So if you've got a profile like this, you know, which of any of those elevations might you raise? And I think when I look at this profile, I'd be inclined to raise cautious and imaginative, because there aren't any obvious linkages from this person's HDS profile between the cautious and imaginative, perhaps back to their bright side profile, except, I mean, there's the low adjustment, which might relate to high cautious, but usually that's more of a relationship with the no social anxiety piece on the ambition scale. So it'd be really interesting to explore what this adds. especially because for cautious, they've got this score at the 85th percentile, but actually their sociability and ambition scores on HPI are both above the mean at the 61st and the 70th percentile, which isn't really necessarily what you would expect to see in relation to a higher score, or certainly an elevated score on cautious. So it'd be really interesting to ask the individual, so when does this cautious tendency come out? When does it display itself? Is it perhaps more linked to the self-critical nature from the low adjustment rather than a more sort of social anxiety piece? Are they more likely then perhaps to question the validity of their contributions because of their self-doubt? And in fact, does this indeed stop them from contributing, which would be a part and parcel of being higher on cautious? And what about the positives? You'd explore some of that as well, because they're not very high on it. What are the positives about being high on cautious that maybe they feel they're able to use? Maybe it's around being careful about what they say, or having a more considered approach. And you could ask around that and whether that's ever been a characteristic that they feel has been of value to them. So those would be some of the things that I'd ask around cautious for this person. And then, but what about imaginative? Their score there is at the 83rd percentile, so it's fairly elevated. What's interesting though is on their HPI, as I said, there's no obvious links to their bright side. They're low on inquisitive. So it's not an elevation. It's not like a sort of, an exaggeration of the curious piece from the bright side personality profile. It's something kind of on its own. It's a sort of distinctive feature just as a potential derailer. But they are also very low on science, on values, which actually I haven't circled here, but here this low score on science. So appreciative of less logical, less rational, more intuitive kinds of ways of thinking. So you could kind of maybe add on that low science to the more elevated imaginative, to ask them maybe about, the counterproductive sides of being higher on imaginative. So maybe asking them about what they think about the feasibility of their ideas, the practicality, the logic that they apply. Do they ever lose people or confuse people? When does this tendency emerge? There might be very specific situations when this happens for them. But also, definitely to mention the positives. Where are they a force for change or for innovation? On their bright side profile, actually, they're lowish on prudence. So maybe there's an element of that adds into this higher imaginative piece about being flexible and adaptable and open to change. So that could be a theme and a pattern that you could explore on this particular profile. So that's example one of two examples I've got from moderate scores, and finding moderate scores as a useful thing to explore on an HDS profile. So on this profile then, we've got moderate scores on excitable, skeptical, and leisurely. And of course, I might address each of these, but the one that really stands out for me as adding something extra here would be the leisurely elevation. The other two, excitable and skeptical, will have been touched on to some extent because this person is really, really low on adjustment on the HPI, and we know that low adjustment is very strongly correlated with higher scores on excitable and skeptical on the HDS. And there will have been some common themes from across those three scales then that might have emerged already from the discussion around low adjustment. But I can't see anything obvious from the HPI bright side profile that would link to the high score on leisurely, or would even have addressed any of the themes that you might associate with a high score on leisurely. So I definitely want to raise some issues around this. So again, because it's a moderate score, you might want to start with the positives first. So positives about being high on leisurely are that ability to sort of really, focus their attention completely on something. It's just that the something they've chosen to focus their attention on will be what they've chosen to do rather than what anybody else actually wants them to do. But that focus obviously can be beneficial in terms of just getting stuff done. But then to ask, do they think they ever tip over into the more counterproductive style? Do they put things off? Do they procrastinate? Do they prefer to set their own agenda? Do they, tend to focus on things that they've chosen to focus on? Do they feel that maybe they resist the demands of others, or, ask them about how they feel about being diverted from their chosen task by other people or demands from others. I think that's definitely something that's worth exploring, because it might surface from time to time. If you did also want to mention the moderate scores on excitable and skeptical, you might link it in to the low score, the very low score on adjustment, because it seems this is forming a fairly coherent pattern around self-doubt, anxiety, emotionality, mistrust, suspicion, worry that others perhaps are either trying to deceive you, or worry that they're not going to like you. Those are all themes that could come together. But you could also pick out then the positives of each. So for excitable, there's the positives around bringing that passion, that intensity to things that they're interested in, work that needs doing. There's an urgency of response quite often with people who are higher on excitable, or certainly when it's something they want to focus on. And with skeptical, obviously the positives around that are about being astute and about being shrewd, and perhaps being able to evaluate information in a fairly critical way. So those are some ways in which I would use the moderate scores on this particular HDS profile to add more information over and above what you've got from the bright side, and indeed from the values. So those are examples of what you might do with moderate scores. Moving on then now to the second scenario. So this is around having a look to see, okay, I haven't got any high scores, but have I got any very low scores on the HDS? Because I think sometimes those can be of value, especially if they are in opposition to other aspects of the HDS profile, or perhaps if those very low scores you feel add some extra resonance to the bright side description. Now, please bear with me on this particular profile, because I know it's not the perfect example, because actually, yes, they've got some high scores. They've got actually 3 high scores on the HDS. But what I'm asking you to do, but they have got some very low scores that I think are of interest. If we kind of imagine, say, for instance, that mischievous score was more like at the 84th percentile, then in this scenario, what I'm interested in here is these really low scores on cautious and dutiful. And actually, I also had a look at some of the subscales on prudence, because one of them, the not autonomous piece, this person's got a 0 score. So they're really not concerned at all about what other people think of them. So that, combined with this low cautious and low dutiful, really kind of brings together a theme of having a total sort of lack of fear, being a really strong risk taker, being unapologetic even, and around kind of, doing your own thing, having that autonomy, not wanting to please people, not having any kind of social anxiety about how you're coming across to other people. Those are really strong themes that are coming out from these very low scores. And I think is that this pattern, this almost like a syndrome of this sort of fearlessness and risk-taking, exaggerates some of these mischievous tendencies. Again, I'm asking you to imagine, in fact, that's a slightly lower score. But, this person, when they were asked to describe themselves, said things like, I keep my superiors happy so I can get on with what I want to do. That's clear manipulation. They said, I'm not afraid to make mistakes, so complete lack of remorse, no regrets. And they also said, I put myself in uncomfortable situations because I want to. It gives me energy. So this fearlessness is actually really actively wanting to test those limits, actually feeding off that, getting energy of testing those limits is characteristic for this person. And I don't think it would be quite as strong as that if the cautious and dutiful and the not autonomous were not so low. I think that together tells you a story for that person, and a very strong story. Sorry, I've gone back one slide. Let's go back to that very low score. So yeah, for me, that paints a really interesting picture, and it is a way of using very low scores on the HDS to add extra layers of interpretation. Then I've got a second example here where we've got a very low reserved score on the HDS. I know, so again, some of their scores are kind of teetering on the high, particularly colourful at the 89th. But if we have a look at that very low reserved score, do we think, does that add anything? Would we even bother looking at it? If you sort of maybe imagine that, you know, colourful wasn't quite so high, and therefore that very low reserve thing was almost the most extreme score that you're going to interpret. So you can see, again, we've got a consistent pattern here between the very low reserved, which sort of strengthens these bright side high scores on sociability and interpersonal sensitivity. One of the descriptors around being low reserved is the word considerate. And I think this low reserved score does to some extent heighten the notion perhaps of the door always being open from this person, of them always being accessible to others. They've also got the high colourful, the elevated colourful, which obviously adds another sort of interpersonal layer here. But more interestingly, in a way, in terms of keeping this in the affective zone, we've got this high affiliation on the MVPI. So a really strong interpersonal theme coming through here for this person, which the very low reserved score on the HDS heightens. And then our final example of a very low score here is, on this one, again, we've got a very low reserved score, coupled with high-ish sociability and interpersonal sensitivity. So again, we've got some strong interpersonal skills going on there. But on this one, we've also got a pretty low score on imaginative. And in fact, when you have a look at the HPI, their inquisitive score is really low at the 3rd percentile. So you might think of this low imaginative piece as actually adding to and increasing the consistency of this pattern from the low inquisitive. They also are very low on aesthetics and science on the MVPI. So for me, those three things go together as somebody who's perhaps got more narrow interests, isn't a particularly broad or wide thinker. And in fact, one relevant descriptor from low imaginative on the HDS is about having few interests. And I think that few interests piece is a descriptor that I would take, and I would add that on to that low inquisitive and the low aesthetics and science as forming a very coherent, consistent pattern for this person. However, I mean, one word of caution here, I would say to be careful with any of the descriptors that are associated with low scores on the HDS, because not all of them will apply, and you really, really need to look at the whole profile to see whether they would or not. Because for instance, another descriptor for low imaginative is about being reluctant to change. But, you know, not necessarily everything on the HPI for this person would support that. Their prudence score, for instance, is middling, which suggests, can be fairly flexible when they need to be. So if you were to use very low scores on the HDS and you were to interpret them, just make sure that you filter the descriptors that you use and that they actually coincide with other aspects of the profile. Okay, so that's all around very low scores. Scenario 3 then is about simply exploring what makes a person distinctive. If you've got a profile with no high scores on the HDS, maybe you could have a discussion with them around what they think makes them distinctively them, what makes them stand out, just as a kind of general conversation, thinking of things outside of the HDS scales, outside of the HDS framework. And I've got some questions here of examples of things that you could maybe run through with an individual. So you could ask them, what do you think makes you stand out? How would you say you are different to most people? Can you think of a quality that everyone admires you for at work? Or what is the one thing you think everyone would say about you? Or what is your social reputation? So those are some ideas around questions that you could ask. For this particular person, you can see they don't even have any moderate scores here. So it's like, wow, what am I going to do with this? So this notion of having the conversation around what they think makes them stand out is very relevant here. And this is where, yeah, you do need to look then at other aspects of the profile. Hopefully you've got a bright side profile alongside the HDS, so have a look at peaks and troughs there. And if you've got the values profile, obviously you can bring that in. So it's about focusing on other distinctive themes to support the conversation you're having with the individual, and be interesting to hear what they think makes them distinctive, perhaps before you actually feed back on the profile in that sense. So for this person, you know, you could ask them around their high adjustment, whether they're going to be steady and composed and even-tempered. Ask them about, you know, to what extent they feel that characteristic of composure is appreciated by others, to what extent it's been useful to them. Also on HPI, their ambition is highish, so you could explore that as something distinctive, maybe how it's been of benefit to them. And then also for this person, you do at least have some standouts on their values. This person is high on both altruistic and commerce. So lots to talk about there. And in fact, that's a particularly interesting combination. I have seen this actually in profiles that I've done as well, where you've got people who are very business focused, very focused on making money and making a profit, but they also bring that altruism piece as well. So that's a kind of interesting combination to talk about, you know, when one comes to the fore more than the other, and how they can achieve business goals at the same time as having that sort of social care and concern for the welfare of others. So lots to explore there, but not really much in the HDS. And then, which brings us on to the final scenario, scenario 4, which in a sense is a kind of extension of the previous point. So this is about exploring, okay, so you don't have any high scores on the HDS, but what aspects of your personality do you think maybe have most contributed to your success in your career or just in life generally? And again, I've got some suggested questions here. So just to run through these, you might want to ask around, because they have no high HDSs, they are going to be pretty steady. They are going to be consistent. They aren't going to be changeable, you know, and so you can ask around whether that steadiness, whether that consistency has actually is something they're aware is something that they have, and whether that has contributed in any way to their success, whether that, you know, what are the positives of being like that. But you could also ask, and I do think it's worth asking this in the nicest possible way, whether you think actually, whether the individual actually thinks having no extremes, no kind of spikes in their personality has limited their career progress in any way. Has it held them back at all? Does it mean that they don't stand out as much as other people? Or are there ways, you know, conversely, are there ways in which it has benefited them? And so, yeah, to have that discussion around, okay, so, but are there any aspects of their personality that they think have made a significant contribution to their success, and how have they, what are they, and how have they been able to use them? So it's about that kind of balance between whether having no potential derailers has had a dampening effect on their career progress, or to what extent it has actually helped them. So this, again, this is a real person. So the things that you might have a look at here on that bright side profile would be around the ambition and the interpersonal sensitivity. We might expect them to reference particularly the interpersonal sensitivity. You know, this is a max, this is a really, really high score on interpersonal sensitivity. So when you're asking them about what they think has contributed to their success, you would probably expect some themes around interpersonal skills and understanding of other people, or possibly team orientation or developing of other people, whatever might come through. And ambition might also feature as well. You know, they're probably likely to be fairly results oriented, likely to take on responsibility for things. So again, that's something you can have a discussion around. So yeah, and also actually their prudence is kind of middling. So they've got that flexibility, potential relative sort of flexibility, adaptability piece. So that is another thing that you could ask them. But you would also ask them around this HDS profile and pointing out, you know, whilst actually mostly it should be a positive thing, has having no extremes here, do they feel it's had any limiting effect or impact on their career? So this is a real person. I've had this discussion with this person. And in fact, he did feel that it had, to some extent, hindered his career progression. He felt he was often ignored. He felt that he was perhaps passed over for promotion. He felt that people kind of didn't feel like they needed to bother with him because he was always okay. He said people didn't need to support him or look out for him or to please him. He definitely felt he'd missed out on promotions, and he definitely felt that kind of calm, steady, consistent approach meant that he didn't stand out. And in fact, he was one of 2 shortlisted candidates for a selection process, and he was the unsuccessful candidate in that process. He also, though, just to add another layer of complication to this one, he also has no high scores on the MVPI, which I guess to some extent kind of adds to his beigeness. And certainly one would have a conversation with him around, you know, what is it he really wants out of life? Because there aren't any strong themes coming from the values profile. Okay. So those are some suggested ways in which you might approach the various kinds of ways in which you might get a profile with either no high scores or no moderate scores or some with very low scores and so on, and how you can hopefully make the most of that. This slide then, we thought you might be interested to see the relationship between having no derailers and bright side personality. This is based on our UK data only, I should say. And we ran this analysis because, again, yeah, this is something we get asked about in terms of, well, you know, what's the overlap between not getting any high scores and a bright side profile. So you might find this useful just in your understanding of the interplay between bright side and dark side profiles, just at one generalized level. Obviously, you know, the real magic and beauty of these profiles comes alive in the detail of each unique profile, but still, you know, you can see here that clearly the most sizable relationship between the non-existence of derailers and the bright side of personality is the adjustment scale. So that is, the more emotionally stable one is, the more likely it is that you have no scores at the 85th percentile or above. And I guess, you know, this shouldn't be surprising, given that derailers are linked to our own insecurities and anxieties. And of course, high adjusted people are less insecure and less anxious. So the higher you are in adjustment, the fewer derailers you're likely to have. And this, you can see, is by far the most sizable correlation. We have reported the other 3 statistically significant correlations, and in size order, they are interpersonal sensitivity, ambition, and prudence. And I guess, you know, for interpersonal sensitivity, that makes sense because a lot of the derailers have an interpersonal element to them, an interpersonal aspect or impact. And if you're more interpersonally skilled, then perhaps you're less likely to have some of those derailers. Ambition is interesting because on this, you've got obviously that purpose and results focus. There's that element. There's also an element of not being socially anxious, which of course does figure in some of the derailers. And there's a sort of upbeat quality to people who are high on ambition, and optimism as well, and sort of positivity about one's achievements. So perhaps that links to being slightly less insecure and a bit more self-confident about oneself, and therefore fewer derailers. And then finally, prudence. I think higher scores, people who score higher on prudence, you know, they're more disciplined, they're more self-controlled, they have higher impulse control, And actually, yeah, quite a few of the moving against derailers have quite a lot of impulsivity associated with them. So that's probably why you're getting that significant relationship there. So the more disciplined, the more self-controlled you are, the fewer derailers you have. But you can see down here that, oh, sorry, I've done that thing where I've moved on a slide. Again, with learning approach, sociability and inquisitive on the HPI, there's no relationship there between scores on those scales and how many high scores you're going to have on the HDS. So we just thought, you know, those very keen, very avid HDS users out there would be interested in having a look at that. Really hope that you all enjoyed that. I hope that you found it useful. As I say, I mean, you may have other approaches that you use as well. I believe that after this, we will be sending you a link to the recording, so you can always go back to any of those points or any of those questions that I've mentioned in the session.